Montana Territory, 1878. The wind howled across the plains like a mournful spirit, carrying dust and broken promises in equal measure. Rebecca Davis stood motionless at the edge of Timber Creek, a small but growing settlement nestled beneath the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. At 22, she possessed nothing but the faded blue calico dress on her back, a small leather satchel containing her few worldly possessions, and a pride that stood as tall and unyielding as the mountains themselves. Her chestnut hair, pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, caught the late afternoon sun, revealing hints of gold amid the brown. Exhaustion lined her face, yet her green eyes remained clear and determined. Rebecca believed with absolute certainty that the frontier was a place where a woman must rely solely on herself. The lesson had been branded into her heart through bitter experience. Trust others, and they would inevitably disappoint you. The only safety in this wild country came from keeping everyone at arm's length. What she needed, was simple: a job, a roof over her head, and to be left alone. Independence was her shield against the cruelties of the world. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness she refused to indulge. Timber Creek would be merely a stopping point, a place to earn enough money to move on to somewhere bigger, somewhere she could disappear completely. "Excuse me, miss," a deep voice called from behind her. "You look like you could use some assistance." Rebecca turned, shoulders stiffening defensively. The man before her sat atop a dappled gray horse, his lean frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Colton Lawson, though she didn't yet know his name, was 25 years old with a face that combined boyish charm and weathered experience in equal measure. His jaw was strong but clean-shaven, and his blue eyes crinkled at the corners as he studied her with undisguised curiosity. Unlike many frontier men, there was a gentleness about him that seemed at odds with his obvious strength. "I neither need nor want assistance," Rebecca replied coldly. "I can manage my own affairs." Colton's smile never faltered. "No doubt you can, miss. But nightfall's coming, and Timber Creek isn't the safest place for a lady alone after dark. The boarding house is just up the road. Mrs. Fletcher keeps a clean establishment." He touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "I'd be happy to escort you." Rebecca hesitated. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and the memories of her journey, the unwanted advances, the dangers she'd narrowly escaped, were still fresh wounds. Pride warred with practicality. "Very well," she conceded stiffly. "But I require no escort beyond directions." "As you wish." He pointed toward a white two-story building at the end of the main street. "That's it there. Tell Mrs. Fletcher that Colton Lawson sent you. She might have work if you're looking." Rebecca nodded curtly and started walking, acutely aware of his gaze following her. She didn't see him frown slightly, didn't notice the concern in his eyes as he watched her limp slightly with each step, favoring her right ankle. It wasn't until she heard the soft clip-clop of hooves beside her that she realized he was pacing her, keeping a respectful distance but unwilling to abandon her entirely. "I told you I need no escort," she snapped. "And I'm not giving you one," he replied easily. "I'm heading to the general store myself. Just happened to be going the same way." Rebecca knew it was a lie, but she lacked the energy to argue. By the time they reached the boarding house, darkness had fallen in earnest, and she was secretly grateful for his presence, though she would never admit it. Mrs. Fletcher was a plump, pleasant woman in her 50s who took one look at Rebecca's travel-worn appearance and ushered her inside without questions. The mention of Colton's name seemed to work magic, earning Rebecca not just a room, but the promise of breakfast and consideration for a position, helping with the laundry and cooking. "Any friend of Colton Lawson's is welcome here," Mrs. Fletcher said warmly. "That young man has the kindest heart in Montana Territory." "He's no friend of mine," Rebecca corrected her. "We just met on the road." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes twinkled knowingly. "That's how it starts with Colton. He has a habit of collecting strays, both animal and human." Rebecca bristled at being called a stray, but hunger and exhaustion kept her tongue in check. As she settled into her small but clean room that night, she vowed to keep her distance from the handsome cowboy. The last thing she needed was another person making promises they wouldn't keep. 2 days later, Rebecca had secured her position at the boarding house, earning room and board plus a small wage by helping with cooking, cleaning, and laundry. She worked with fierce determination, speaking little to the other boarders and rebuffing any friendly overtures. Her goal was clear: save enough money to move on before winter. She was hanging sheets in the yard behind the boarding house when Colton appeared again, leading his gray horse and carrying a parcel. "Good morning, Miss Davis," he called. Rebecca had reluctantly given her name to Mrs. Fletcher, but she was surprised and irritated that he knew it. "Mr. Lawson," she acknowledged stiffly. "Brought you something." He held out the parcel. "Noticed your boots are worn through." Rebecca stared at the package, then back at him, anger flaring. "I don't accept charity." "It's not charity," he replied calmly. "It's a fair trade. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you're good with a needle. My shirts need mending, and I need someone who won't charge me half a month's wages to do it." Rebecca hesitated. The worn soles of her boots had indeed been letting in water, and her feet ached constantly. Still, she was suspicious. "Why not ask Mrs. Fletcher to mend your shirts? She's busy enough." His smile was disarming. "Besides, she charges more than you would." It was a transparent excuse, but Rebecca found herself reaching for the package. 3 shirts mended for 1 pair of boots. "That's my offer." "Done." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she shook it. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, the brief contact sending an unexpected jolt through her body. That night, alone in her room, Rebecca unwrapped the boots with trembling fingers. They were simple but well-made, sturdy enough for frontier life, but not so plain as to be purely utilitarian. Someone, Colton, presumably, had taken the time to polish them to a soft shine. It was the first gift she'd received in years, and despite her determination to remain detached, she felt a dangerous warmth spread through her chest. The next week passed in a pattern. Rebecca would find Colton waiting with his shirts, and they would exchange a few words, never more than necessary on her part, though he seemed determined to draw her out. She learned he owned a small ranch outside of town, that he'd come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, that he lived alone except for a motley collection of animals he'd rescued. "Why do you care?" she asked bluntly one evening as she handed him his mended shirts. "About the strays, I mean." Colton considered the question seriously. "I suppose because everyone deserves a second chance. This land can be cruel, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to help." Rebecca looked away, uncomfortable with how his words seemed to touch something buried deep within her. The frontier is no place for sentimentality. Out here, it's every person for themselves. "Is that what you truly believe?" he asked softly. "Or is it just what you've learned to tell yourself?" She had no answer for him. The defining moment came on a stormy evening in late September. Rebecca had ventured into town to purchase thread with her meager savings when the skies opened without warning. The deluge turned the street to mud within minutes, and as she hurried back toward the boarding house, her foot slipped on the slick ground. She went down hard, pain shooting through her ankle, the same one she'd injured before arriving in Timber Creek. She struggled to her feet, only to collapse again as her ankle gave way. Rain plastered her hair to her face as she tried once more to stand, gritting her teeth against the pain. "Rebecca." Through the curtain of rain, she saw Colton riding toward her, concern etched on his face. Before she could protest, he dismounted and was at her side, strong arms lifting her effortlessly. "Put me down," she demanded, mortified. "Not until you're somewhere dry," he replied firmly, placing her gently on his horse before swinging up behind her. His chest was warm against her back as he urged the horse forward, one arm wrapped securely around her waist. Rebecca was acutely aware of his proximity, of the strength in the arm that held her, of the clean, earthy scent of him beneath the smell of rain. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with gentleness that she found herself fighting tears. At the boarding house, he carried her to the porch and called for Mrs. Fletcher, who appeared immediately with exclamations of concern. Rebecca expected him to leave then, his good deed done, but instead he remained, helping her to her room and then fetching the town doctor despite her protests that she needed no such thing. Dr. Mills confirmed a sprained ankle, but nothing broken. "Stay off it for at least a week," he advised before departing. Colton lingered after the doctor left. "I can bring some liniment tomorrow," he offered. "It'll help with the swelling." "Why are you doing this?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The events of the day had stripped away her usual defenses, leaving her vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be for years. Because you need help, he said simply. And because I care what happens to you. You shouldn't. The words were harsh, but her voice broke on them. I'm leaving as soon as I've saved enough money. Timber Creek isn't my home. Something flickered in Colton's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps. Where is home for you, Rebecca? The question caught her off guard. I don't have one. Not anymore. Everyone needs a home, he said softly. Not just a place to sleep, but somewhere they belong. I don't belong anywhere, she replied, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed her exhaustion and loneliness to show. And I've learned the hard way not to count on others. Colton studied her for a long moment. Someone hurt you badly, he said, not a question but a statement of fact. I'm sorry for that. But not everyone will let you down, Rebecca. Some promises are kept. After he left, Rebecca lay awake for hours, his words echoing in her mind. The frontier had taught her harsh lessons about trust and survival. But there was something about Colton Lawson that made her wonder if there might be exceptions to those rules. True to his word, Colton returned the next day with liniment and a book of poetry. Thought you might be bored, he explained, placing the book on her bedside table. It was my mother's favorite. Over the next week, as Rebecca's ankle healed, Colton visited daily, bringing small offerings, fresh biscuits from the baker, wildflowers in a jam jar, stories of his day's work. Despite her determination to maintain emotional distance, Rebecca found herself looking forward to his visits, to the sound of his voice and the way his presence filled the small room with warmth. They shared pieces of themselves during those quiet afternoons. Rebecca learned that Colton had lost his parents to influenza back east, that he'd come west seeking something he couldn't name. In turn, she cautiously revealed fragments of her own history, growing up on a small farm in Ohio, losing her father to the war, her mother's remarriage to a cruel man who had made it clear Rebecca was unwelcome once she turned 18. So you came west alone, Colton said, admiration in his voice. That takes courage. Or desperation, Rebecca countered. There wasn't much choice. There's always a choice, he replied. You chose to survive, to make your own way. That's something to be proud of. By the time Rebecca was able to return to work, something fundamental had shifted between them. She still maintained careful boundaries, still planned to leave Timber Creek, but she no longer avoided Colton's company. They developed a routine of sorts. He would visit the boarding house in the evenings, and they would sit on the porch, talking as the sun set behind the mountains. October arrived, painting the hills in gold and crimson. Rebecca had saved nearly enough for her planned departure when the incident at the saloon occurred, the event that would irreversibly alter her relationship with Colton and her future. She was returning from delivering fresh linens to the small hotel down the street when 3 cowboys, clearly drunk despite the early hour, blocked her path. Their expressions made their intentions clear, and Rebecca felt cold fear grip her spine. Look at what we found, boys. The tallest one slurred, reaching for her arm. The pretty little laundress. Rebecca jerked away, but found herself backed against the wall of the general store, the men surrounding her. Leave me be, she warned, trying to keep her voice steady. Come on, sweetheart, we're just being friendly, another said, his breath reeking of whiskey. Why don't you show us some hospitality? The lady asked you to leave her alone. Colton's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stood a few feet away, his posture deceptively relaxed, but Rebecca saw the dangerous glint in his eyes. This ain't your business, Lawson, the tall cowboy growled. I'm making it my business, Colton replied evenly. Move along now, before this gets unpleasant. The 3 men exchanged glances, weighing their chances. Colton might have been outnumbered, but something in his stance, a quiet confidence, a certainty in his own capabilities, made them hesitate. Ain't worth it, one muttered, and with a few parting curses, they staggered away. Rebecca released the breath she'd been holding, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking. Thank you, she managed, the words unfamiliar on her tongue. Colton's expression softened as he approached her. Are you all right? She nodded, though the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. I'm fine. It's not the first time I've dealt with unwanted attention. It shouldn't happen at all. There was anger in his voice, but she understood it wasn't directed at her. Will you let me walk you back to the boarding house? This time, Rebecca didn't refuse his escort. As they walked, Colton seemed unusually thoughtful, his usual easy conversation absent. It wasn't until they reached the boarding house that he spoke again. "Rebecca, I've been meaning to ask you something." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "My ranch hand quit last week. Headed to California for the winter. I need someone to help with the cooking and tending the house while I manage the cattle." He met her eyes directly. "The position comes with room and board, and better wages than you're making here." Rebecca stared at him, suspicion immediately rising. "Are you offering me a job out of pity?" "I'm offering you a job because I need help," he replied firmly. "And because I think you'd be good at it. Nothing more, nothing less." She wanted to refuse outright, but practicality intervened. Better wages meant reaching her goals sooner. "I need to give Mrs. Fletcher proper notice." "Of course." Relief flashed across his face. "Take whatever time you need." Later that evening, when Rebecca told Mrs. Fletcher about the offer, the older woman smiled knowingly. "I wondered when he'd ask," she said, patting Rebecca's hand. "Colton's ranch is a lovely place. You'll be comfortable there." "It's just temporary," Rebecca insisted, "until I've saved enough to move on." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes were kind but knowing. "Of course, dear. Just temporary." A week later, Rebecca found herself riding beside Colton in his wagon, her few belongings packed in a trunk at their feet. The journey to his ranch took most of the morning, the road winding through golden aspen groves and pine forests before descending into a sheltered valley. When the house came into view, Rebecca couldn't help but gasp softly. It wasn't large, but it was beautifully built, a two-story log structure with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the autumn sunlight. A barn and corral stood nearby, and beyond them stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The setting was almost impossibly picturesque, nestled between hills with a creek running through the property. "It's not much," Colton said, misinterpreting her silence for disappointment, "but it's home." "It's beautiful," Rebecca admitted honestly. "Did you build it yourself?" Pride touched his features. "Most of it. Had help with the roof and some of the heavier work." He guided the wagon to a stop before the house. "Let me show you around." The interior was as welcoming as the exterior. Simple but comfortable furnishings, polished wood floors, a large fireplace in the main room. Colton led her upstairs to what would be her bedroom, a sunny corner room with a view of the mountains. "My room is at the other end of the hall," he explained, clearly wanting her to feel safe. "The bathroom is between, with a door that locks from either side." Rebecca was touched by his consideration. "Thank you. I'll bring up your trunk," he said, leaving her to settle in. That night, after a simple supper that Rebecca insisted on preparing, "I'm here to work, not to be waited on," she told him firmly. They sat before the fireplace. The autumn chill kept at bay by its warmth. There was an easy companionship between them now, grown from their weeks of evening conversations in town. "Why did you really bring me here, Colton?" Rebecca asked suddenly, the question that had been hovering at the edges of her mind all day. He looked up from the piece of harness he was mending, his expression serious. "Because I needed help, as I said. Because winter's coming and it's hard to manage everything alone." He paused, then added softly, "And because I enjoy your company, Rebecca, more than anyone else's in a very long time." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. "I'm still planning to leave when spring comes," she reminded him, though the words lacked conviction. "I know." He returned to his work, but not before she caught the flicker of sadness in his eyes. The weeks passed in a rhythm of shared work and quiet evenings. Rebecca found herself settling into life at the ranch with surprising ease. She cooked and cleaned, mended clothes, and even learned to help with some of the livestock when Colton was shorthanded. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Colton was a considerate employer, never demanding more than she could give, always expressing gratitude for her efforts. But as November deepened toward December, their relationship began to shift in subtle ways. Their conversations grew more personal, their silences more comfortable. Rebecca found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the gentleness with which he handled even the most stubborn animals, the rare but beautiful sound of his laughter. One evening, as the first snow of winter fell outside the windows, Colton returned from checking the cattle with news that troubled the peaceful routine they'd established. "Marshall stopped by the north pasture today," he said as they sat down to supper. "Said there's a gang working its way through the territory. They've hit 2 ranches already, stealing cattle and whatever else they can carry. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. How close? Too close. The Hendersons' place, about 20 miles east. His expression was grim. John Henderson was shot when he tried to stop them. He'll live, but only because his wife knew how to treat a bullet wound. Rebecca pushed her plate away, appetite gone. What are you going to do? What I can. Bring the closest herds in, set up watches. He met her eyes across the table. Rebecca, if you want to go back to town for a while, I'd understand. It might be safer. The offer was genuine, she knew. Another example of his consideration for her well-being. But the thought of leaving him to face potential danger alone was suddenly unbearable. I'm staying, she said firmly. 2 people watching is better than 1. Relief and something warmer flashed in his eyes. Thank you. That night marked another shift in their relationship. The threat created a new intimacy between them, a shared purpose that transcended employer and employee. In the days that followed, they worked together to secure the ranch, checking fences, moving cattle closer to the barn, establishing a system of signals should trouble arise. Colton taught Rebecca to shoot his spare revolver, standing behind her to guide her aim, his breath warm against her ear. The physical proximity sent her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the weapon in her hands. When she hit the target for the first time, his proud smile made her flush with pleasure. The snows deepened, blanketing the valley in white. December brought Christmas preparations, and though Rebecca had initially dismissed the holiday as unimportant, Colton's childlike enthusiasm was infectious. Together they decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and Rebecca secretly sewed him a new shirt as a gift, using fabric she'd asked Mrs. Fletcher to send from town. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire after a special supper, sipping hot cider. Outside, the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, isolating them from the world. I have something for you, Colton said, reaching beneath his chair and producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Rebecca accepted it hesitantly. You didn't have to. I wanted to. His voice was soft. Open it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate design of mountain flowers. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft leather. You mentioned once that you used to keep a journal before you came west. He looked almost shy. I thought perhaps you might want to start again. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Thank you, Colton. I have something for you too. She retrieved the wrapped shirt from its hiding place and handed it to him. His face lit up as he unwrapped it. A simple blue cotton shirt, but finely stitched with careful attention to detail. Rebecca, this is exquisite work. He immediately stood and slipped it on over his undershirt. Perfect fit. The sight of him wearing something she'd made with her own hands stirred emotions Rebecca had been trying to ignore for weeks. The warmth in his eyes as he looked at her, the way the firelight cast shadows across his handsome features, the comfort of his presence in what had somehow become their home. It was all becoming dangerously precious to her. I should go to bed, she said abruptly, rising from her chair. It's getting late. Colton looked disappointed but didn't protest. Of course. Merry Christmas, Rebecca. Merry Christmas, she replied softly, and hurried upstairs before she could do something foolish, like tell him how deeply she had come to care for him. The new year arrived with bitter cold and news that the gang had struck again, this time at a ranch only 10 miles away. Colton doubled his vigilance, often staying out late to check the herds, returning with frost in his hair and exhaustion lining his face. Rebecca worried constantly, watching for his return each evening with growing anxiety. It was during one such vigil, as January's early darkness fell and Colton was later than usual, that Rebecca heard the gunshot. The sound cracked through the stillness like breaking ice, coming from the direction of the north pasture. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and Colton's spare revolver, then saddled the gentlest of his horses with hands that trembled but didn't falter. The snow made riding treacherous, but fear for Colton's safety drove her forward. As she crested a small rise, she saw them. 3 men on horseback surrounding Colton, who was on foot beside his fallen horse. Even from a distance, she could see the blood staining the snow beside the animal. One of the men was shouting, his revolver pointed at Colton, who stood with his hands raised but his posture defiant. They were too far away for Rebecca to make out the words, but the situation was clear. Colton was outnumbered and in grave danger. Rebecca dismounted, tethered her horse to a tree, and moved closer on foot, using the terrain for cover. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain they would hear it, but the men were focused entirely on Colton. "Don't want trouble," she heard Colton say as she drew near enough to hear. "But those cattle aren't yours to take." "Won't be yours either if you're dead," one of the men replied, his voice harsh in the winter stillness. "Last chance, Lawson. Turn around and walk away." "This is my land," Colton said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." The leader raised his revolver higher, aiming at Colton's chest. "Your funeral." Rebecca didn't think, she simply acted. Stepping from behind the tree, she raised her own weapon and fired into the air. "Stop." All four men turned toward her, startled. Colton's face drained of color when he recognized her. "Rebecca, get out of here," he shouted. Well, the gang leader said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What have we here? Your woman, Lawson? She's brave, I'll give her that." "Leave her out of this," Colton growled, taking a step forward only to freeze when all three revolvers turned back to him. "Drop your gun, lady," one of the other men called to Rebecca, "or your man gets a bullet right now." Rebecca's hands shook, but she kept the revolver steady. "There are 3 of you and 2 of us," she called back, her voice stronger than she felt. "But you should know the marshal and his deputies are right behind me." They heard the shot too. It was a desperate lie, but in the gathering darkness, with the wind beginning to howl through the trees, it created just enough doubt. The men exchanged uncertain glances. "She's bluffing," the leader said, but he sounded less confident. As if in answer to a prayer, distant hoofbeats became audible over the wind. Rebecca had no idea who it might be, a neighbor, perhaps, or a traveler on the road, but the gang members clearly weren't willing to take chances. "This isn't over, Lawson," the leader spat, wheeling his horse around. The other 2 followed suit, and within moments they had vanished into the darkening forest. Rebecca ran to Colton, her legs nearly giving way with relief. "Are you hurt?" He caught her by the shoulders, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. "What were you thinking? They could have killed you." "They were going to kill you," she shot back, suddenly furious with him. "What was I supposed to do? Watch from the window?" For a moment, they stood locked in mutual fear and relief, the tension between them palpable in the cold air. Then Colton pulled her against his chest, holding her so tightly she could scarcely breathe. "I thought I was going to lose you," he whispered into her hair. "When I saw you standing there with that gun." Rebecca clung to him, the revolver still clutched in her numb fingers. "I couldn't let them hurt you," she admitted, her voice muffled against his coat. "I couldn't." The hoofbeats grew louder, and they broke apart as 2 riders appeared. Their nearest neighbors, the Wilsons, out checking their own property line. "Lawson, that you?" Jacob Wilson called, reining in his horse. "Heard a shot. Everything all right?" "Had some unwelcome visitors," Colton replied, keeping one arm around Rebecca's waist. "They're gone now, but my horse is injured." With the Wilsons' help, they determined that Colton's horse could walk, though it wouldn't be able to carry a rider. They made their way slowly back to the ranch, leading both horses through the deepening snow. By the time they reached the house, exhaustion had replaced the initial rush of fear, leaving both Colton and Rebecca subdued and shaken. After tending to the horses and securing the house for the night, they sat close together before the fire, neither willing to be separated from the other just yet. The events of the evening had stripped away pretense, leaving raw truth between them. "Rebecca," Colton began, his voice low, "what you did today was both the bravest and the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed." He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns across her palm. "I don't know whether to thank you or scold you." "I made my choice," she said simply, "and I would make it again." He studied her face in the firelight, his expression unreadable. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. Rebecca felt the last of her defenses crumbling, worn away by months of his kindness, his respect, his unwavering presence in her life. "Because I care about you," she whispered. "More than I should. More than is safe." Colton's hand tightened on hers. "Rebecca, listen to me. I know you came here planning to leave when spring arrives. I've respected that, tried not to pressure you." He took a deep breath. "But tonight, seeing you in danger, I can't pretend anymore. I don't want you to go. Ever. Her heart stuttered in her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying I love you. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that changed everything. I love your strength and your pride, your courage and your determination. I love the way you face each day on your terms, asking nothing from anyone. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. I'm saying I want to give you a home here, if you'll have it. I want to give you everything I have, including my name. Rebecca stared at him, overwhelmed by his declaration. The wall she had built around her heart, since leaving Ohio, trembled dangerously. Colton, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now, he assured her. I know this is sudden. I just needed you to know how I feel, after what happened today. But Rebecca knew her own heart, had known it for weeks even as she'd tried to deny it. The prospect of leaving him, of returning to her solitary existence, had become increasingly unbearable. Tonight had only confirmed what she'd been unwilling to admit, that she had found something precious here, something worth fighting for. I love you too, she said, the words unfamiliar but right. I've tried not to, tried to remember that the frontier is no place for such feelings, but I can't help it. Joy blazed across Colton's face. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost reverent, but it kindled something fierce within Rebecca. She returned it with all the emotion she'd kept locked away, all the longing and fear and hope that had built over their months together. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, Colton rested his forehead against hers. Stay with me, Rebecca, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife. We can build something beautiful here together. The offer, everything she'd convinced herself she didn't want or need, now seemed like the answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was making. Yet doubt still lingered. What if I'm not what you think? She asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if I'm not enough? You are everything. He replied with such conviction that tears sprang to her eyes. Everything I've been searching for since I came west. They talked through the night, making plans and sharing dreams as the fire burned low. When dawn broke over the snow-covered valley, it illuminated two people transformed, no longer alone in a harsh land, but united against whatever challenges might come. Word of the attempted raid spread quickly through the territory. The marshal increased patrols, and neighboring ranchers formed a protective alliance, sharing information and standing watch. Rebecca and Colton were careful not to lower their guard, but they refused to let fear dictate their lives. In February, with snow still blanketing the land, they were married in the small church in Timber Creek. Mrs. Fletcher wept openly during the ceremony, while Jacob Wilson and his wife stood as witnesses. Rebecca wore a simple dress of deep blue that Colton had ordered specially from Helena, and the look in his eyes when he saw her walking toward him was something she knew she would treasure forever. I, Colton, take you, Rebecca, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he said, his voice steady and true. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. As Rebecca repeated the vows, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in Timber Creek with nothing but her pride and determination, convinced that the frontier was a place where love couldn't survive. Now she stood beside a man who had offered her not just his heart and home, but a future brighter than any she had dared to imagine. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, now shared, the separate room transformed into a future nursery, they came together as husband and wife. Colton's touch was tender yet passionate, his patience infinite as he showed Rebecca a side of love she had never known. In his arms, she found a belonging so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered afterward, cradled against his chest. For what? He asked, stroking her hair where it spread across the pillow. For seeing something in me worth believing in. For waiting until I was ready to believe it too. Colton kissed her softly. You've always been worth believing in, Rebecca. I'm just grateful you finally allowed someone else to share the journey. Spring came early that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the soil. As April turned the valley lush and vibrant, Rebecca stood on the porch of their home, watching Colton work with a new foal in the corral. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach, where their child, not yet announced but already deeply loved, grew beneath her heart. The gang that had threatened them had been caught attempting to raid a ranch near Helena, their leader now serving time in territorial prison. Peace had returned to their valley, though Colton and Rebecca maintained a watchful vigilance, never taking their safety for granted. Mrs. Fletcher visited often, delighting in their happiness and already planning for the baby she somehow intuited was on the way. The Wilsons had become dear friends, their shared experience during the winter creating a bond that transcended mere neighborliness. As Colton finished with the foal and walked toward her, his smile as bright as the spring sunshine, Rebecca reflected on how completely her understanding of the frontier had changed. What she had once seen as a harsh, unforgiving place where trust was folly and love a dangerous weakness, she now recognized as a land of possibility and connection. The very challenges that had seemed designed to keep people apart had instead revealed the profound necessity of standing together. "What are you thinking about?" Colton asked as he climbed the porch steps, pulling off his gloves. Rebecca smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat abdomen. "About how I arrived here with nothing but my pride, and you offered me everything, including your name." She watched his eyes widen with understanding, then fill with joy. "And about how soon that name will belong to one more person." Colton's whoop of delight echoed across the valley as he lifted her in his arms, spinning them both in a circle of pure happiness. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you, Rebecca Lawson," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I have words to express." "And I love you," she replied, standing tall and proud beside the man who had taught her that the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from the courage to open one's heart. Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Rebecca and Colton stood together on the porch of the home they had made, not just a structure of logs and nails, but a sanctuary built of trust, respect, and abiding love. The frontier stretched before them, no longer a wilderness to be feared, but a landscape of promise where they would write their story together, one day at a time.